The date is December 22nd, 1984. Bernard Goetz is a 37-year-old white man in New York City, heading to meet up with some friends on a weekend afternoon just a few days before Christmas. Having previously been a mugging victim, Goetz tucks his small, unlicensed handgun into his pants and boards the 2 express train with about a dozen other passengers. Aboard the train are 4 Black teenage boys. By various accounts, they are being rowdy. One of the teenagers gets up from his seat and approaches Goetz. Accounts differ as to whether the teenager simply asked for or demanded $5 from him, but Goetz, fearing he is about to be mugged, shoots the teenager in the chest. Goetz then turns to the boy's friend and unloads a bullet that lodges into his spine and left shoulder blade. He continues his rampage, firing a shot into the arm and chest of a 3rd boy. Finally, he moves on to their 4th friend, who is seated in his chair, and fires the 2 remaining bullets. 2.5 years later, Bernard Goetz was acquitted of attempted murder and first-degree assault. In his new book, 5 Bullets, Elliott Williams brings to life this harrowing subway ride, why this case captivated New York and beyond, and the shocking details that led to the verdict. Our guest today is the author of Elliott Williams.
Traditional etiquette says that politics, religion, and money should never be brought up in polite company. And we're here to discuss all 3. I'm Debbie Hancock, a conservative and a Christian living in the Deep South.
I'm Ariel Gorin, a born and raised New Yorker and a liberal Jew. We're asking the hard questions and actually listening to what the other has to say.
Is Anybody Listening podcast starts now.
All right, Debbie, what are you reading this week?
Oh, so much. It's really hard to narrow it down. I'm going to do my best, though, because we have a really exciting interview that we want to get to.
I know. I can't wait to share it.
Last week, we talked about the Texas primary that was coming up. The Democratic ticket has been set, but there is a runoff scheduled for Senator John Cornyn and Attorney General Ken Paxton. What stood out to me about this is that Trump is set to endorse one of the candidates, which is no surprise, but he is urging whoever he does not endorse to drop out. Again, this just stands out that Trump is deciding that his opinion is the only one that matters. Regardless of who he chooses, I certainly have a favorite in this, but regardless of who he chooses, I hope both candidates will stay in the race and allow the people to make the decision as to who should represent them in the Senate.
I completely agree on that. I will also say, of course, as a Democrat on the other side of the aisle, one thing that really stood out to me here is I believe that Jasmine Crockett and James Talerico got a combined close to 3.3 million votes in Texas. The number of registered Democrats who voted in this primary outnumbered the number of registered Republicans in the state of Texas who voted in this primary. And so Democrats all over the country, I think, are rightfully celebrating right now. They showed that a Democrat can win in Texas, right? Like, those numbers are in our favor. Of course, so much boils down to where independents will fall in this election, as it does almost in every recent election of the past, decade or more. But this is a very, very good sign for Democrats in a state that has long been sort of our white whale.
I often say that I am poor indicator of what's going to happen. I would hold the applause or celebration because I think
absolutely.
Every single election cycle, Democrats say this is the year we're going to take over, especially with John Cornyn. He is such a respected senator. I really think Cornyn will pull this off.
I am certainly not uncorking the champagne yet, Debbie. Don't want you to misread that, but it was a very reassuring sign. It was, and you know how it goes these days. I think we are looking for any positive signs we can, and I think you're right. So much of how this goes down is also going to depend on who the eventual candidate is on the Republican side of the ticket.
That is a fair point. Also in Texas, Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Tim Scott sent a letter last week to the Treasury Department asking them to go around Congress and approve $200 billion in tax cuts. They're urging the administration to cut capital gains taxes by adjusting the basis for inflation. So as it stands now, if you paid $100 for an investment several years ago and you sold it today for $300, you would pay capital gains tax on that entire $200 of earning. The senators, though, are urging Treasury to adjust these earnings for inflation. And I know the reaction from you, Ariel, and maybe some of your friends, is going to be this is another tax break for the rich. But I actually differ on that. I think as a simply a matter of economic policy because I don't support going around Congress. But this is actually not just a benefit for the wealthy, considering the fact that the bottom 50% of households in the US, real estate is their largest asset. So I think unlocking this cash flow could be really significant. The last thing I'm paying attention to, certainly not least, is everything that's going on in the Middle East. There's been a lot of chatter about how this war is splitting the MAGA base with high-profile people like Tucker Carlson, Megyn Kelly, Steve Bannon. But the truth is Republican voters really do overwhelmingly support this at 84%, although they are certainly out of step with the majority of Americans who don't support it. One poll that stood out to me was that 55% of Americans don't believe Iran poses a threat to the U.S. And I think that this is really key reason why people aren't supporting the war. I think the Trump administration is spending a lot of time talking about how long this is going to take, and they're at odds. Trump is saying we're wrapping up. His officials are saying that this is going to take some time. They would be wise to spend more time making a case for why this conflict and why these strikes are necessary, and that could make a big difference in public opinion.
Yeah, I think there hasn't been a lot of communicating around this period. And we see that in a lot of the president's statements, right, where he says, oh, this could go on for weeks, or we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. And he's sort of very vague and not really sharing a lot. It's worth noting that 92% of the American public supported intervention in Afghanistan in 2001. With the Iraq War, just a few years later, that number had shrunk down to 76. Of course, again, there was a specific rationale, as we all now know, that was later put into question around uranium enrichment in Iraq. But that number dropped to 76% for intervention in Iraq in 2003. 41% of the American public at large currently supports this intervention. So these are very, very different numbers than what George W. Bush saw at the start of what were, at the beginning, quite popular, I guess you'd say, interventions and campaigns, but that ended very unpopular. So I guess my big question is, when you're starting at 41%, like, where does the current administration really have to go from there? You're starting from a very unpopular place as a very unpopular president. And again, with seemingly no plan to move this campaign forward or get us out of there. And I think that the reason that because of that, that's why we're seeing such little support.
I do think if this ends well, comparatively, and this doesn't take too long, I do think the numbers could go up, but we'll see.
I think that's definitely true, right? It's really hard in the middle of this to really get a sense for how things are going to go, and if this could actually be the sort of generational change for Iran that I think many of us are hoping it could be.
What are you paying attention to?
What am I paying attention to? So obviously also paying attention to what's happening politically in Texas and what's going on in the Middle East. One additional thing I wanted to add to everyone's list was I noticed a really interesting article in the Washington Post a couple weeks ago. The headline was, "Conservatives want schools to teach this strict life path they say avoids poverty." A very sensationalist headline, of course. Like, imagine that these days. But they highlight a New York charter school where they are majority low income from Black and Hispanic families, and children are taught that there's a formula that they can follow to avoid poverty in the future. And it involves graduating high school, getting a full-time job, and getting married before you decide to start a family. And it's interesting, right? Because I guess you could call some of those things somewhat predicated on socially conservative values, certainly getting married before you have kids and whatnot. But basically, I thought it was such an interesting headline because I consider myself to be quite liberal. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that, except that, you're not teaching kids how to do those things, right? And I think we've all been teenagers. We all know that if you're being told by an adult that, like, you should do something, you're probably less likely to do it. So while I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this sort of 3-step life plan, I'm kind of more interested in making sure that kids have the skills that they need to get a job that works for them when they graduate high school, or that they have like the art classes or the debate club or the chess club that's going to keep them there when they're struggling academically, right? So I just thought that was kind of an interesting one. And it's also a very interesting segue into another article that came out recently in the New York Times about the birth rate plunging and why some people actually think that's a good thing, because when you dig into the numbers, you actually see that the U.S. birth rate is declining steepest among the very, very youngest of mothers. So teen pregnancies have gone down in an incredible way. That's sort of been an incredible success story for the U.S. over the past 2-3 decades. But when you look at sort of the cohort of college educated, especially, and slightly older mothers, that is a birth rate that is held constant, right? So there is sort of this other story that's being told that a lot of moms are just sort of choosing to wait a little bit longer to start a family, which actually correlates with this other idea of teaching this conservative sort of 3-step program that people want taught. But it's kind of funny, right? Because there's these differing messages. There's a whole slew of MAGA conservatives and non-MAGA conservatives who are so focused on this idea of declining birth rate and that it's going to be destructive to the country. And yet when you dig into these numbers, possibly painting a different story, and also, again, like at odds with the idea that we should actually be curbing teen pregnancies and youth pregnancies until people are actually maybe a little bit more responsible and financially stable.
On a different note, I often listen to podcasts where the reporter plays attorney trying to solve a crime. Today, we are communicators playing podcasters, playing attorneys, trying to get to the bottom of this crime. Ariel, do you want to introduce our guest today?
I'd be honored. Elliott is a CNN legal analyst, a former prosecutor and former senior official at the Department of Justice, an expert cake baker, and hands down the best Halloween costumer every year. Elliott, welcome to Is Anybody Listening?
Is anybody listening? That's the, are you asking, or is anybody asking? That's the philosophical question,
it's
right?
Cheeky.
It is cheeky.
Yeah. Well, thank you again so much. Fun fact for the rest of the world, because I know, Elliott, you know this, but I am a pop music super fan.
This is true.
I looked this one up to verify. And of the 59 actual people mentioned in the Billy Joel song, We Didn't Start the Fire, Bernie Goetz is only one of 3 who remain alive to this day. Can you name the other 2?
They would be Chubby Checker and Bob Dylan.
Bingo. Well done. I feel like you've done your research on this one, too.
I think I'm literally right now the world's foremost expert on Bernard Goetz. And so, yes, facts like that, I do have that committed to memory.
Those tend to stick out.
Yeah. But, I would not say that Billy Joel is the great chronicler of American history. However, it is significant that of the people, places, and things identified in We Didn't Start the Fire, which are quite consequential in the 20th century. You're talking about Bridge on the River Kwai and Russians in Afghanistan and Reagan and the Middle East crisis, that somehow Bernie Goetz is regarded as being significant enough to make it into that pantheon. And that's sort of part of what undergirds the book. This was one relatively quick moment in New York City history, but still somehow ended up, ascending to being regarded among some of the most significant events of the 20th century. That's part of what I wanted to unpack in the book.
Absolutely. And it's a perfect segue. 40 years have passed since this case concluded. Mm-hmm. And what made you want to revisit it now?
Yeah. So I would say I was 8 when the shooting happened in 1984. And it really is one of the first major news events I recall. It was, Ariel, you grew up in New York. I grew up just outside the city. On the nightly news every day, this was a seminal moment. And it was something about this story gave it a really intense life far beyond New York City. It's not that I wanted to go back and avenge the shootings of these 4 people or rehabilitate Bernard Goetz after 42 years or whatever, but more, you realize there are stories that or incidents that are kicking around in the back of your head because you grew up hearing and reading about them. Now, I think years, or at this point, decades later, thinking about media, race, crime, law, and what are the things, where do they converge? This is really a big one in the 1980s, and I thought it would be really interesting to unpack in a book.
Absolutely.
And because I have so much time on my hands, why not write 90,000 words of heavily researched information? That seems like a good way to spend 2 years of the time I have with my children.
Naturally. Well, for those of us that were not growing up in New York when this happened, let's back up a little bit.
Well, you should have.
What's wrong with you?
Seriously. Why weren't you?
Yeah. You'll have to take that up with my parents. But let's back up a little bit. Like
Yeah.
most things, the shooting didn't happen in a vacuum.
Did not.
So before we dig into the actual trial and what happened, can you walk us through what life was like in New York City in the 1980s?
Pretty shitty. So New York City in the 1980s, and I literally like the t-shirt. I love New York. I always have. It's a very special place, singular in the United States. However, it was also singularly rough in the 1980s, just by way of example. And I talk about this in the early part of the book, 5 Bullets. Consider that the homicide rate in New York City in 1984 hovered around, I want to say around 1,700 homicides a year. They're right now an average of maybe about 300 a year. It's just rougher on an order of magnitude. The city was fiscally mismanaged and broke and laying off teachers and sanitation workers and police officers. The city sought bailouts from the federal government because it was literally on the verge of bankruptcy. There's an iconic New York Daily News headline of Ford to City dropped dead when Gerald Ford who was president at the time in 1975, had denied or said no to bailing the city out. Now, ultimately, he relented. But the point is, it was just rough. It was covered in graffiti. It was covered in litter. And the place just had not figured out how to manage itself. And people really felt unsafe. Even people who were of the city sort of felt at home in the city, respected it, loved it, but really did feel unsafe. I am grew up in one of the many immigrant families from the city, but who moved out, whether it's to Long Island or to Westchester County or to New Jersey because of this. Yeah, okay, you get a little bigger real estate if you move a few miles outside of a big city, but also, there was a perception that the suburbs were safer back then, and people just didn't. It was just pervasive throughout the city. So it was a tough time in city history, even if people really did love being there.
I definitely remember a very different New York City, the one that we, grew up in and around. So in our intro, we intentionally tried to share only the information that Bernie would have had when he decided to pull the trigger.
Yeah.
But of course, there were many other factors and details, some true, many untrue, that the media reported on and that jurors learned about both before they were selected and then during the trial.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more, kind of fill in some of the detail around the lives of these 14 victims, what they were up to that day, and how that additional information about their own personal stories wound up being considered by the jury.
Sure. And just a quick, for those who don't know the story well, December 22nd, 1984, Bernard Goetz gets on a New York City subway car. There are 4 black teenagers from the Bronx on the car at the time: Daryl Cabey, Troy Canty, James Ramseur, and Barry Allen. Now, they were goofing off and roughhousing and playing around and asking people for cigarettes and doing pull-ups and pounding on the seats and so on. They did not attack or harm anyone. Now, one can question whether people on the train felt threatened or scared, and some said they sort of did. Many others did not. So it's an ambiguous question as to what to make of how people who were on the train car at that time felt, right? But needless to say, Bernard Goetz thought he was about to be mugged. The moment he got on the train, pulled out his gun, shot the 4 teens. Now, they all had pretty copious criminal records at the time. They were nothing of the serious sort that you hear about afterward. James Ramseur ultimately ends up getting a very serious sexual assault conviction later on after this incident. But prior to that, it was a lot of thefts, a lot of beating people up and things like that, and had been sort of arrested and in and out of the system. Now, they also had family lives and homes, particularly Daryl Cabey, who ends up being the most tragic figure in the 4, or at least having the most tragic story. Daryl Cabey grows up in a 2-parent household with his mom and dad and his siblings. His dad's ultimately killed. He's a taxi driver and gets crushed, run over by his own taxi, fighting off a carjacker, right? Which is sort of the most South Bronx emblematic New York City story ever, where a family was trying to make it and ultimately had this unspeakable tragedy that sort of set the family's course on a path. I will also note Bernard Goetz, whom I interviewed for the book at length, he still emails me a decent amount. And that's a whole thing. That's a
a
whole
whole nother story.
that's
Whole
another
other episode of the podcast.
Oh, that
You're in the Bernie files, huh?
the Bernie file. Oh, the paperback is going to be lit when I put this in. No, but he still emails me from time to time, which is thoughts. So he sees me on an interview where I have thoughts. And right before the book came out, he emailed this article from 1985, right, detailing all of the boys' the young men's criminal records. And he says, you in the book, because I'd given him an advance copy, he said, you in the book dwell on my using the N-word. If you don't also include this, that's the criminal histories, then the book isn't fair. And I said, all right, well, I didn't respond. But, what I would note is that both things can be true. One, you have a documented history of the use of ethnic slurs, however, you were not aware, and this is Ariel's question, you were not aware of any of their criminal histories at the time you decided to shoot them. So yes, they had, and this is an important, relevant fact in any legal question. Yep. Yes, something might be true about someone's past, but the shooter didn't necessarily know that at the time he decided to shoot.
Yep.
And then it was brought up in the media, and the jury had access to that, right? So were they deliberating that as well, even though he didn't have that information when he made the decision to pull the trigger?
To some extent, not to get too far into second year of law school criminal procedure. However,
get into it.
Let's
We're
go
ready.
there. Criminal history can come up when a witness is on the stand as a means of, the word is impeaching their testimony, undermining their credibility. So you put somebody on the stand and you say, Ms. Gorin, is it not true that on December 22nd, 1854, you were punished for stealing a loaf of bread from Monsieur Javert? And,
likely.
And, you have to say yes. Well, that is intended to undermine your testimony. And that's part of the game. It's just whenever a witness comes up and they do have a criminal record, for the most part, it can almost always come in.
I thought it was interesting and noteworthy that despite Bernie's confident posture in the trial that he was in grave danger and simply acting in self-defense, that he fled from the subway station immediately, and he was a fugitive for 9 days.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how he was portrayed in the news and the public's reaction to this shooting?
So it's important that we started with talking about how rough New York City was. People sort of felt under siege, and also that, and Bernard Goetz in particular, felt that the authorities were not doing enough to care for the public or to protect the public or whatever else. And the mere fantasy of the death wish vigilante, of this man in the mold of the main character in the movie Death Wish, this avenger in a rough city who finally clapped back on behalf of all the people who were the downtrodden, aggrieved, unsafe public. Many people, certainly if not a huge plurality, if a small majority of New Yorkers saw him as a hero, as an avenger, as a guy who finally did what needed to be done. I also would note that at the time that this level of support is taking off, largely in the tabloids in New York, the New York Post, the Daily News, Newsday. All that is available is the fact that he's a white guy, because nobody knows who he is.
Right.
Then no one knows his name for 9 days. He's a white guy, a sort of timid, blonde, bespectacled guy. These 4 Black teenagers from the Bronx, which at the time, the South Bronx, which was regarded as a pretty rough part of New York City, a pretty rough
Even just
borough.
saying that was telling people a lot in the news,
people knew
right?
enough. They knew enough, and that they must have threatened him, and they were almost a stand-in or an avatar for every punk and thug who had hassled someone in this very rough city. And so it was just easy to put a face on the terror, if you want to call it, that the many people felt, even though, like Ariel said at the beginning of the program, not a lot of information was out there, and people were really filling in the blanks with what they wanted to believe.
Yeah, it's just wild. I think, viewing this through today's lens, it's shocking that in that moment, so much of the public across the city and across the nation sort of came to buy into this hero narrative, right? I think you do such a good job in the book of trying to help us imagine what it was like to feel that sense of danger each day, and to sort of put try to put ourselves in the shoes of people and why it was that so much of the
Yeah,
public, which again, one of the things I found most shocking about the book was how support for Bernard Goetz at the time really cut across racial and
it
ethnic
really
divides
did.
in a way that like is kind of hard to imagine today, right?
Yeah, what I think the thing that I find hardest to get my head around is that in the absence of the internet or social media, Bernard Goetz was able to generate the kind of widespread, whether it's support or notoriety or whatever
Yeah.
else, but without literally think about it, there'd be a newspaper every morning, a couple hours tops of nightly news, but CNN had only been founded 3 years before, and not everybody had it because it was only
Right.
on cable. Right? You don't have Fox or MSNBC or any of those things. You don't have Twitter or Instagram or Reels or any of that business. It's really just on the basis of a couple newspapers, yet somehow the story goes instantly global. Like I would note that his eventual trial, when he does go on trial some years later, Le Monde in Paris and Der Spiegel in Germany cover the trial. They have reporters in the courtroom for the trial. And again, this isn't in the age of you tweet something and people in Germany or Paris see it. So yeah, even without the whole media ecosystem we have today, this still ended up turning into something really, really big.
There's a lot of interesting parts about this case. There's the media's response to it. There's the racial component. As I was reading it, what stood out to me the most shocking part was the fact that all this was predicated on the fact that he felt unsafe, not that he actually was. And you talk a good bit in your book about whether the same standards would have applied if the shooter had been Black and the victims were 4 white kids.
Yeah.
But there's another scenario that I want people to consider, as Ariel and I talked about. Women fear really on a regular basis for our physical safety.
Of course.
We have fear that we're going to be physically or sexually assaulted or worse. And something that stood out to me is a woman who seeks to obtain a protective order is required to provide documentation and records to prove that there is a threat. In fact, when I was confirming this, one law office website specifically said, simply stating you're afraid is not enough. You need concrete, objective proof that you have reasonable fear of imminent serious harm.
However, and this is not providing legal advice to anyone, however, you have an easier time killing your domestic partner than getting a protective order against him, right?
So wild, right?
Right, and I mean that it's to your point, Debbie, you would have to document all sorts of stuff to establish some sort of ongoing risk of physical harm. However, if you fear that A, your domestic partner is about to mug you, or B, is about to use lethal force against you, you would be empowered to use lethal force. Now, look, I live in the same real world you do, and I think many courts and juries and prosecutors or whatever else are going to be suspicious of a woman's claims that, well, I felt threatened for my life at this time, therefore I used lethal force to defend myself, because absent, this is getting into self-defense law a little bit, someone just hitting you or striking you may not be perceived as lethal force, right?
Right.
A partner would need to come at you with a knife or something like that, and then everybody would agree that lethal force would be acceptable. But yes, you're right. It is a little bit bizarre that you would have to document out the wazoo the need for a protective order when in fact just punching someone back in the face or even perhaps using lethal or deadly force might actually be easier.
Yeah.
Again, not legal advice to anyone. It is a tragic quirk in the law stemming from centuries of how women are treated in the legal system. I'm not going to dispute any of that.
Was the law misapplied in this trial? Does the law actually allow for fear to be a license to kill?
Oh, it absolutely does. Yeah. There's no question that the law allows for fear to be a license to kill. And I talk about this, in the book somewhat. The standard was murky at in New York at the time, as is the case in everything legal. The legislature wrote the law in like 1825 or something, whatever the year was, but just put the word reasonable in there, quote unquote reasonable, but didn't define what reasonable fear was. Is it a subjective fear, like, oh my gosh, I fear in my heart that something bad's going to happen, or an objective fear, I fear something, and it's the same fear that everyone in the world would, or everyone in the city would have, right? And because of that is it objective? Is it subjective? The law has just never been defined on that. Ultimately, this case goes all the way up to New York State's highest court that defines this idea of reasonableness. What is it? And it's actually both. First, you assess, was Elliott's fear sincere? And then did, Elliott act in a way that comported with how society would also want, right? It's and if you're confused by that last 15 seconds then you're right. You should be, because it's really confusing and it's a jumble. It's a mess and it's very hard for people to understand. So, Debbie, to your question, was the law misapplied? I don't think it was misapplied. I just think it's very hard to impose these vague words on very specific actions by people who have their own thoughts and biases and just feelings. It's just really hard. Lawyers struggle with this. The last point I'll make here is that even the most basic legal term, and I'm not going to quiz you on what it is, but one you've heard in every cop show or every trial show is reasonable doubt. If I were to ask you, what does it mean? You're like, I don't know. And frankly, if you were to ask most judges what it means, they don't know either. It's really, really complicated and vague and confusing. But yet we ask people very human people to sort of put on their armchair lawyer hats and try to divine what these things mean. And it's very, very hard. So no, the law wasn't misapplied. The law is just really hard to apply.
I think how you described it in your book is they were asked to be psychologists, not lawyers.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, well, I want to go back. We talked a tiny bit about the media environment surrounding all of this, and your book does such a great job of really painting the picture of just what an incredible sensation this story became. And so I want to talk a little bit about one specific question and then sort of a broader question, but I had a sneaking suspicion in reading this that the long lag between when the crime occurred and when Goetz was eventually indicted on the second try, worth noting as you talk about, and then finally brought to trial 2 years after the shootings, might have contributed a lot to his eventual acquittal.
That's interesting, yeah.
Do you think a speedier trial might have yielded a different outcome here?
I don't, and for a couple reasons. One, trials take a really long time to make happen. That whole fight over what the one basic word reasonable means took the greater part of a year, even that. And then picking a jury took 4 months and so on. The bigger thing is I actually think more than the amount of time it took to get to trial, the 9 days without information about who the shooter was, actually, I think did more to taint the public perception of it, because by the time he was apprehended and people could identify him, if anything, knowing who he was made him more sympathetic because you could put a face on it. And the fact that he's a little bit kooky, people were able to sort of push that aside. For the most part, though, the fantasy was built in that 9-day period, and I think there was just no dialing it back after that. Far more than the amount of time that had transpired since the shooting itself.
And analyzing this case through a 2026 lens, seeing how kind of that really at the time, like nascent New York Post, Rupert Murdoch style of news and how critical it was to public opinion on this case. KB Ramsar sold their stories. Goetz certainly did against the advice of his own attorneys, right? Before this went to trial. Jurors spoke to the press after those 9 days and how critical those were to sort of like filling in the picture that then the public saw in their mind's eye. When it comes to covering controversial cases, do you think that the media has kind of learned anything since then?
Oh, gosh. No, because...
What?
Well, the news is all fake. You know that. Come on.
Of course.
But no, but it just back to this question of how hard it is to apply facts to law as a general matter. People just go on their guts. I think just in terms of what they think about what happened in a case or a trial or whatever else. And I think because of that reality, not even a problem. It's just, it is a reality that the law is hard to understand and people are just going to impose what they think should happen. Yeah, I think he did it. Did the guy need killing? Did the guy deserve shooting? That's sort of how people see the world, kind of. And I think that more than anything else skews how people approach the way they see individual crimes or cases or whatever else.
So would this go down the same way today?
I know, that's a wonderful question. I don't know. Now, I think the introduction of electronic media would have made it, I think, far more hysterical today than it was back then.
And it was pretty damn hysterical then.
It was pretty hysterical. But just think about, and the example I use briefly in the book is Luigi Mangione. Far more than any of the, the more almost racially polarizing major violent events of the last decade or so, the Kyle Rittenhouses and things that people are sort of politically or racially sort of divisive in many ways. Let's take that out and just talk about Luigi Mangione. The fact, and this is the individual, the young man, the University of Pennsylvania graduate who shot the CEO of United Healthcare based on his feelings and, quite frankly, the feelings of many people about their health coverage and about the industry generally. The social media tornado around that made the case, or makes that story what it is in many ways. And I just think the fact that people, in the absence of knowing anything about these two individuals, about the case, about the particulars, just turn. I mean, think of how many wedding proposals Luigi Mangione is getting right now. And that's a lot of that is not just about how people feel about healthcare. It's because the internet has sped things up quite a bit. Now, back then, let's go back to 1984. With the tabloids, so went public opinion. That is what people read. And a fun fact about when I use the word like the tabloids, I'm talking about the Daily News, the New York Post, Newsday were the ones at the time. If you know newspapers, if you know a newsstand, think about it, folks. The tabloids are all smaller. They're all sort of the squares as opposed to the big rectangles. And remember, this is really deep cut. If you go back to 15 or 20 years ago, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times were even bigger than they are now. You had to hold them like this to read them. Well, tabloids were largely that size so you could read them easily on the subway, right? You could commute with them and sit with them in your lap and read them. It was what people read every single day. And when Murdoch took over the New York Post, and with a deliberate intent to shift the coverage of the Post, which was at the time a left-leaning publication before he bought it, but to shift it towards sensation and crime and splashy news stories, that just gotten in people's heads in terms of how they saw the world. They didn't need Twitter or whatever to get there, and because they had sort of the one thing everybody read.
Halfway through the book, we finally get to the trial, and throughout the book, you're reading that these victims were shot. And when we start talking about them testifying or considering testifying, I'm reminded that they are actually alive. Obviously, Bernie had no way of knowing that the bullets he fired into the boy's chest and back would not be fatal, and thankfully they survived. But do you think the impact of the severity for which the public and jury weighed his actions predicated on that?
A little bit. I think as time went on, so this is sort of in the 90s, but also a little bit after Goetz got to New York City, so this is early January, he started getting less sympathetic the more he talked. Literally, the more people heard from him, the more people saw him, people just started realizing, wait a second, something's a little off here. Even if we can
He's
support...
not us.
He's not us. He is kind of, but he's not, right?
Yeah.
And even the National Rifle Association, which provided him a tremendous amount of support over the years, eventually distanced themselves from him specifically, making the point that, look, we believe in the right to self-defense. Not really kooky people who shoot other people, but the right of Americans, it's a God-given right or fundamental civil right to defend themselves, right? And everybody sort of started drawing space from him. Once Daryl Caby came out of his coma and it was clear that he was going to be brain damaged, that he was paralyzed from the mid-chest down, it was just much harder to demonize him or see him as the avatar or the symbol of everything that was wrong and rough about the city. He was a young man who was paralyzed, who was brain damaged. And I think if you were to really ask people, look them in the eye and say, okay, you feel unsafe and you maybe even support what happened here. Do you feel that a young man's paralysis and brain damage to the capacity of a 9-year-old is worth some broader concept or some broader... Do you feel safer now? Do you feel like a message has been sent? What would you say to the kid's mother? Like, what are your thoughts? And I actually think, and this gets back to the internet point, and just in an anonymous world, it's just easy for everybody to be an armchair or whatever. But people didn't really stop to think, wait a second, what happened here, even if legally justified, was really bad and really tragic on an almost Dickensian level for all of these people, for the shooter and the 4 young men.
Well, I have a lot more questions, but
Okay.
Ariel told me I was limited.
Oh, really? Is that how it works? Like, is Ariel the
We have to
bad
agree
cop?
on everything.
to
We have to come
agree.
to an
Bad
agreement.
cop? Bad
I
cop?
usually say no to more things, probably.
Do we want it?
Because Ariel's crazy. That's why. You
Yeah.
just got to rein her in.
No, but we do want to, and we don't want to give away too much. You know the
I support
ending,
that.
but like a lot of historic movies and books, it's what happens along the way that makes it so fascinating. And Anderson Cooper, I think, said it best in his review when he said, "Wow, what a ride back to New York in the 1980s."
Who?
Anderson Cooper.
I don't know who that is. Just a guy.
I don't know.
They just got
they just
quotes
found some
and they told
guys
me
on
who.
the street.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But it's true. What a ride, because I felt like I was on the subway with everything that you were describing in the different sways. The writing was so interesting.
Nice.
But I also loved learning about how this case gave many notable figures that we know today, like Rudy Giuliani and Al Sharpton, the power that they have.
Yeah.
So despite knowing the ending, I really did find myself flipping through the pages on the edge of my seat. Even when they were talking about what the grand jury would be charging him with, they were gaining momentum. And I thought, maybe there's still going to be a better outcome. So it's a lot like when you watch the Titanic, you know the ending, but you still find yourself engrossed in it and hoping for a better outcome.
Exactly. Jack is going to end up on that board and he's going to freeze. Like, it's the iceberg is coming. I mean, literally, it has become a metaphor.
Edge, like,
the tip
away.
of the iceberg.
The tip of the iceberg. That's right. Well, that's actually a great question to end on, because I somehow don't think Leonardo DiCaprio would be the right fit to play Bernard Goetz, but if all goes great and this gets optioned for like
I know for a fact it's not getting optioned. However,
Netflix series. No, we're manifesting this for you. Okay, so who would play Bernard Goetz?
Oh my gosh, he plays. Right off the top, and maybe it's just fresh in my mind because he just hosted SNL. Ryan Gosling would be great. Because it's just sort of the skinny sort of
interesting one.
He could do the spectacled nerd well, I think, and maybe it's just because he's fresh in my mind because of the SNL. He was quite good. And he's sort of
Debbie had suggested Adam Driver, and I kind of loved that one.
I could see that. I could definitely see that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Just and to Debbie's point, just about the things you learn and the things you hear and so on. I actually think the one of the more interesting aspects of reporting and writing the book was just talking to the people. It's 4 decades past, they're dying off. The main source for the book, actually, probably Bernard Goetz's defense attorney, Mark Baker, died during the writing of the book. And I note that in the preface, that the fragility of human existence or whatever else. And it was really neat. I found that they all just wanted to talk. And some of it is, they're aging and all of them were just getting older, but they really enjoyed telling their story, whatever it was, or just sitting down with someone 3 or 4 decades their junior and just talking through it, like talking to Judge Justice Crane, the judge who oversaw. He just wanted to talk. It was a very almost warm and almost loving conversation. And I think, looming overhead is they all sort of know this is the end, literal end for at least one of the sources in the book, but for many others. And that was the thing that struck me across all of these conversations I'd had, whether it's with someone from the NRA or the police officers in New Hampshire or New York City or whatever else. They were just very grateful to talk. The only people that I really couldn't get or who did not agree were Rupert Murdoch was one. Rudy Giuliani, his folks just blew me off and they were sort of obnoxious about it. But notably the victims and their families they wouldn't agree to talk on the record for the book. And that I was sort of bummed at that, but
Well, Elliott, thank you so much. This was so illuminating. Again, the book is 5 Bullets. We highly, highly recommend it. And we're so grateful for your time. Thank you again.